And welcome back, everybody. It's hour number 2 of Talkback, brought to you this morning by Knife River Residential. Quality workmanship, competitive pricing, and attention to detail. Now for your home project, call 532-5250 for a free estimate or go online at kniferiver.com. Selway Armory on Stockyard Road. More guns and ammo than anyone in Missoula, Montana's premier firearms dealer. Bill Darling at Primary Residential Mortgage, promising you excellent service long after your loan is closed at 2112 Dixon. And by Conflux Brewing, Missoula's newest downtown brewery, inviting you to take in the view from their oversized windows. Patty and Main, downtown. Okay, now the actual Montana World Affairs Council on the radio segment is underway. Enough of us blathering about whatever we're blathering about.
Hey, we have to do some for the first half hour.
Yes, we certainly must. That's Bob Seiden-Schwartz. And would you please introduce Professor Stephen Porter?
We have Professor Stephen Porter, and as we did at the beginning of the show, introduced Benevolent Empire, U.S. Power, Humanitarianism, and the World Dispossessed. Stephen is going to be doing a talk tonight at 7 o'clock. Mm-hmm. And please tell us where at the University of Montana, that location.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here. It's exciting to be here. I'll be talking on my book and some related issues at 7 o'clock at Ali Auditorium here in town. So my talk will probably last about 45, 50 minutes, better part of an hour, and then we'll have time maybe for 20, 25 minutes or so to chat.
Right. So we've got just a precious hour here to introduce a topic that goes back not just decades, but literally a couple of centuries in terms of, I read as much as I could through your book, found it fascinating, because this is an area that I tend to geek out into in terms of what is America? What are some of the issues and forces that have shaped it, and particularly immigration, refugee status? We've been dealing with this for extended periods of time, and what we do is we live in this moment. Right. For what we understand is happening and the people coming from different places and what are the issues. But this has been going on for, as I said, centuries. And what I would like you to do is kind of introduce conceptually and by interest, where did you kind of come to this topic? What was your background and interest that you said, I am wishing and fascinated by this issue? So give us a little insight to that, please.
Now, there's an interesting little story about that. It's one of those where I think I had somebody tell me right after I'd gotten out of college many years ago, and I was trying to figure out really what to do then. I thought I was going to have been a lawyer. Had a couple of lawyers who were friends of the family who basically said, don't be a lawyer if you don't really know why you want to be one. I just thought, well, I'd like to study history. I like to study political science, and that seems like the respectable thing to say I'm going to do next, right? Sure. So it was that sort of wandering period. And I remember speaking to somebody who agreed to speak with me about what my future might look like. And he said, here's the thing. When you look back and you see where you've been, where you've come from, it's going to make sense. And until then, it probably won't. And so this is one of those stories. I was in the midst of my graduate studies at the University of Chicago. This was by this point, it was the earlier 2000s, and I'd taken my courses. I'd completed my comprehensive exams. It was a part of a PhD program, so it was a long one. And I thought I was going to do a couple of other different projects that for various reasons just didn't end up making sense to me. But I still had the same kind of intellectual itches that I needed to scratch, and they had to do with things like governance, right? How things are, how society governs itself in certain ways at certain times, especially when there's kind of forms of insecurity or instability, and then also the issue of immigration had long interested me. And as I was trying to decide what I was going to do for my dissertation after, again, a project or two hadn't worked out, I just happened to land this job in Chicago that happened to be doing some research to write small articles for an encyclopedia of Chicago history. This was a big project funded by all kinds of people, developed by the University of California, UCLA, University of Chicago, the Newberry Library in Chicago, and funded by the NEH and so forth. And they were grabbing graduate students at this point, kind of at the tail end of this thing, to pay them a pittance of money to write some of these articles that there was no real expert to write on. So, for instance, a lot of these late-term articles for this encyclopedia were about immigrant groups in Chicago, or at least groups that once were immigrant groups in Chicago for who there was no expert. And so effectively what I became for a while as a researcher and writer for this project, still trying to figure out my dissertation, was a kind of a joint historian and on the street journalist. And for the first one of that, the historian, I was being trained to be. So I had some right to be that. For the latter, I had no training whatsoever. And so I was pounding the pavement in the years after 9/11, white guy, dark suit, going into the neighborhoods where I was hoping there might be some Libyans to see if I could write about Libyans. And you go into a bodega and say, are there any Libyans around here? And I found quickly that was one way to get people to tell me, no, nobody lives here at all.
Right.
So I restructured that and eventually came in touch with different communities around Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And what I recognized was that some of these communities, when I would get to speak to the people there about who they were, where they came from, what they did, some of them struck me as more traditional immigrant communities. They came here because of other family members and so forth. They settled where they wanted. Others who came in as refugees, legally as refugees, seemed to have all of these institutions who had formally helped them to resettle. And so that was simply a way of me asking at that point. I thought, oh, I always thought the distinction between refugee and immigrant, if you will, was about persecution. And of course it is, right? But then that's a sliding scale, right? Who gets in, who doesn't, how much are you persecuted, what kind of luck do you have? But I realized that this formal resettlement angle actually helped to literally define and differentiate those who came in as mainstream immigrants and those as refugees. And that just sort of sparked my curiosity, and one thing led to another. And I came up with this project over the next years.
Well, I will say that is one question I wanted to ask you, is the difference between immigrants and refugees. Because here in Missoula, we have a significant number of refugees that have come here from Africa and who have been facing brutal treatment from their own government, their own peoples, and they literally needed to be rescued.
Right.
And a lot of these folks, they go to our church. They're wonderful people.
Yeah.
They're learning our language. We're learning their language. I mean, there's a lot of good things going on there. But they are refugees. They didn't want to come to America, right? They would much rather have stayed home, right?
And probably if they did, they probably did not imagine coming to snowy Missoula, Montana, right?
Right.
And that also helps to explain the difference between most what we think of as mainstream immigrants and those who come in under refugee or some kind of similar status.
Okay, we're up against our first break. By the way, phone lines are open. If you'd like to visit with Steve Porter, give us a call, 721-1290, and we'll be right back after this quick timeout.
You have Hmong, and I mean, I could mention this, but you have Hmong in Iowa, right? This goes on all the time, and that's one thing that's.
And that was something in your book when you were talking about, particularly the area about after Vietnam falls, when you had Laotians and Cambodians and Vietnamese. I am truly, I say this with all appreciation and humbleness. To read this, to look at the intellectual ability to take all this information and put this into something that is legible and understandable is no small task.
Oh, thanks.
And I say thank you for doing this because it is the fabric of who we are.
Yeah.
And I don't think we as Americans, we react to symbolism
Yeah.
when it comes to these issues, but understanding the depth and complexity and nexus, we don't.
Yeah.
That's my observation.
No, and there is a long history, and it's one that I think we don't quite know completely, and in various ways it can inform our public discourse, right? Better.
It always does for better or worse.
Yeah, right.
And from a political standpoint, the administration using this in the most negative fashion.
Correct.
Yeah. But that's not new.
No.
When you look at the history, and I'll bring this up at some point.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about the cycles of this at times, or at least the echoes.
Because I can well remember my readings about America after the Civil War and the immigrants starting to come out of Europe. An incredible amount of anger, discrimination.
Absolutely.
Whether it was the Chinese or it was various other groups.
Always a different
Europe.
other. Yeah, there's always a different other.
As a New Yorker, I've spent a fair amount of time in the city in Lower Manhattan. And I look around the village at those old brick buildings.
Yeah, those old tenements.
And I could see them filled with the smells and humanity. And these were not good smells.
Okay.
No.
10 seconds, gentlemen.
And then they would move.
Right. Yeah.
Now they're really expensive buildings.
All right, thanks for joining us on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. The Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. We quite literally are talking about the whole world. Right. Coming to God, there's a song in there. Coming to America. Anyway, no, I promise I won't sing it. Steve Porter is joining us here in the studio. Is a professor of the University of Cincinnati, but you wrote an amazing book called The Benevolent Empire, of which you're going to be speaking about tonight. So,
Right. At 7 o'clock at the Ali Auditorium on the University of Montana's campus.
Great.
So there's so many facets to this, but one of the things that I want you to be able to address here is the book itself is about as much as U.S. policy as it is about many other issues in terms of why the benevolent empire. What's the origins of that for you in terms of writing this book? And give us some insight as to that connection to the political part of U.S. overseas as well as domestic policy.
Yeah, certainly. Let me run through this quickly. First of all, the phrase benevolent empire actually comes from a period before my book really concentrates on, and that's the 19th century. And some of your listeners, I have a feeling, know about this history, which is that the benevolent empire was a term often referred to by various evangelical groups in the 19th century, talking about how they were going to create a benevolent empire here, and they meant really the continent, right? And at times that was an empire that in fact went to new places with regards to indigenous populations.
Did we call this a little bit of colonialism?
Yes, so some may well call that a form of settler colonialism. And but once you have the 20th century rolls around, and especially World War I, which is where I begin my study in this book, the term benevolent empire kind of had fallen out of favor. But that said, I think that the United States, many Americans began to look more abroad to export, if you will, some of these same sentiments, very similar sentiments, in the sense, if not always so religiously oriented, in the notion that we have something to offer others, right, who are, by our perception, in need. And so I began looking at World War I, which is both a point when the United States really kind of took a couple of steps up on the rung of power and influence in the world, right?
Now, we weren't asking to participate. This was really a European war.
Correct.
The U.S. is on the outside looking in. In fact, there was a lot of sentiment to stay out of European affairs. Right. So, this, and just kind of setting the tone here a little bit, we then become involved for different reasons. Yeah,
about 2.5 years into that war, the United States enters into it. It's into it in a very decisive, if relatively short period of time. It helps to turn the balance of that particular war. And afterwards, there was a massive humanity in trouble in Europe and what we then call the Near East. Today, we'd often call the Middle East or North Africa as well. And you had Americans who had sort of traded their army stripes, if you will, for those of humanitarian jackets. Herbert Hoover, sort of the later president that we know was considered a hero at the time for feeding millions of people in Belgium and northern France. But you had thousands of Americans spanning out upon much of the globe dealing with this unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. And they did so for the most part because they believed the world needed their help. They also did so in their minds as good Americans. So this was both part of kind of a global international humanitarian ethos, but it also had something to do with the extension of American authority and American power. And to me, there's this nexus, this intersection of power, which is why that's one of the words in my subtitle, and humanitarianism, another one, that have gone hand in hand. And I believe that especially as the United States kind of ascend to this new perch in the world order, especially from World War I and after, this projects of humanitarian aid initiatives, especially on behalf of refugees, but sometimes also other civilian war victims who couldn't leave or didn't leave. This was part of that project of the rise of the United States. And after World War II, it ramped up even more.
So which came first, the chicken or the egg? The aid or the power? Or did the power kind of naturally follow along behind because America has this, amazing amount of resources and military might and money?
Without that power, you would not have had the ability of well-meaning Americans usually being able to go to places to help feed, clothe, provide medical care, and eventually, for some of them, try to provide accommodation for migration to different places, including the United States. So in a sense, the chicken was the power, but yet even that's a little complicated because it depends on who you're talking about. There were those who cared much more about what we might think of as the humanitarian part of it.
So I suspect, and I'm fascinated by, as you're describing this did not just pop up overnight. This goes to a incredibly robust, diverse country. We have people coming in primarily from Europe or in the late 1800s, 1900s. And when you describe Puritanism or any of these other entities, this really has its origins, does it not, in kind of European religious and social thought that gets transplanted into the U.S. So where is it in the U.S. that this is starting to really kind of gain a foothold? How does this come to be? Because this really goes to kind of our volunteerism
Yes.
type of origins as a country. We have government, but we also have, I think, unparalleled volunteerism that is unlike any other country on the planet.
Yeah, so Bob, I'll pick up on two parts of that, both the part of the volunteerism and the connection of that to official government, state, as well as where does this come from, and the connection of that to maybe certain cultural solidarities that you're referring to. Let me start, however, by saying today, here in the early 21st century, there are those who say, this group is claiming to perform certain humanitarian acts, and yet they're performing them just for this one group. We see where their interests are, right? There's a gotcha element, or
they only want the oil,
right? Or this is helping U.S. foreign policy and so forth. I'm not going to be here today or even this evening to sort of argue one side or the other with regards to that. But what I will say is that there is no pure humanitarianism as it operates in the world, and what I mean by that is humanitarianism is a thing in the world, and thus it is inflected and informed by political positions, by your desire to help somebody from your religious group, especially your desire to be a good American, helping to promote American values, if that's what your interest is on the other. And so shouldn't surprise us that many of the refugees, for instance, that Americans tried to bring over here, especially once larger scale refugee programs began in the aftermath of World War II, that those folks were Europeans and that they were from Judeo-Christian backgrounds, right? That the people here in this country looked abroad and they saw suffering humanity after World War II, after World War I, some during the Holocaust even, right? And during the Cold War, and reached out to help them, but that they had an affinity often, right, for certain groups of people, even if the language often was a broader international kind of humanitarian rhetoric there.
And to the point, is there really anything unusual about that if you look at the history of humanity? We tend to gravitate towards what we would define as our own.
Correct.
By ethnicity, by culture, by a host of different reasons. So it's not as if it's purposeful to exclude, it's where we tend to be comfortable as well as feel the most affinity.
Yeah, absolutely. And now to take a more critical stance on that, not because that's sort of the only one that I have here, but just to sort of think about how others have reacted to this, it is also true that, say, during the Cold War, many Americans, in fact, also through the United States government, one was a refugee, right? They defined refugees, including who could come here, who could not, as to whether you were being persecuted by an adversary of the United States government. That is a communist regime, almost completely. There were some exceptions, but pretty few, and that was over decades, right? So what that meant was not only that most people coming over here were European for certain cultural affinity reasons for many Americans, but also were victims of communism, but not victims of other regimes that, in fact, were persecuting them significantly, right? So there's I think, a perpetual debate to have here, and a productive one, a perpetual tension, but it's mostly important, I think, to recognize and to kind of tease this out when we're thinking about these things.
Okay, we're going to take a break. Come right back. About every 10 minutes, we take a break. 721-1290 is our number. Phone lines are open. If you are just sitting listening, that's great. But if you have a question or comment, we would love to hear from you. It's 721-1290. We're coming right back with more with author Steve Porter, and he's written a book called Benevolent Empire. He's a professor at the University of Cincinnati. Will be speaking tonight on the University of Montana campus.
Great conversation.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'm enjoying this. Two things that I would think would be, if it comes up, that among whatever else that you're feeling talking about, that might be useful, and I think this is probably what we talk about, is one, before we go, be useful probably for me to talk about what I see as a change, and this is something I talked about in that epilogue, between the longer period that I deal with mostly in most of the chapters of the book, of the United States using certain humanitarian refugee aid initiatives to kind of enhance its authority one way or the other, that seems part and parcel of it. And what I see in recent decades, especially since the Cold War, that having faded to a significant extent, that the support for, say, refugee, when we talked about this, how there's sort of a much more diversity of refugees, it's much more in line with international norms, that
the legality of definition,
how we think about that, of definition, but also the politics behind it, right? We don't. And so what's and I don't have, and I think I told you on the phone the other day, Bob, I don't necessarily have a great answer, right, for what if one's a refugee advocate, for instance, how you deal with that, because you want to embrace broader human rights, but at the same time, if most people don't care about the Congolese who come in and are not going to support them, what do you do with it? The other thing is the economic thing that you mentioned that I have. I've got some
and that is a big draw, because if you want to make a case, well, there's a lot of different places we can go with this, but if there was a country right now in terms of modern times that has been at the top of the list, in my mind, it's Syria.
Yeah.
And the amount of displaced people.
Right.
And if you want to think of this from a geopolitical standpoint, what this has done in terms of the effect on Lebanon, on Jordan, on the pressure on Israel and the surrounding countries,
Right.
if you're looking at that region geopolitically, would you have said it's in our interest to take in more Syrians,
Mhm.
and yet the objections to taking in people from the Middle East perceived as terrorist
Correct.
supporters
Right,
or
right.
sympathizers
Right.
meets a pretty heavy brick wall here
Right.
too.
And what I can talk about with that too is that kind of resistance to certain people because they're going to be dangerous, they're going to be antithetical to
Perceived
American
as.
values. That's actually not that new. What I think is
Yeah.
newer is that you don't have the counterpunch there to say, but they're freedom fighters, and this is part of the Cold War, and we need right.
Well,
or
I was
something
going to say, I
like
think that the
So we bring 'em in
diminishing of
anyway.
the Cold War
Right.
was a real catalyst. And with the origins of the Red Cross, World War I, and did that precede?
it preceded
It
it, but that's
preceded.
when it really became
It really becomes-
becomes a big deal.
yeah.
Preceded by a turn
And
of the
that becomes
century.
another arm of geopolitical extension too.
Yeah.
Is that we can go to places and provide assistance and even not have a agenda.
Right.
You know, that's the humanitarian part
Well,
of
yeah,
the benevolent
And
empire.
by the way, we also have these wonderful programs in our country that we can
Yeah.
help you out with. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
So-
No, sure. Yeah. Oh, and I never got to the state
seconds. Here we go.
non-governmental stuff, so I may come back to that. The kind of partnerships.
I thought this might be apropos. All right, we're back on.
America.
Yeah, there you go. Little Neil Diamond music there from the jazz singer. Anyway, 721-1290 is our number, 1-800-568-5309. I'm Peter Christian. That's Nick Christensen over there. Bob Seidenschwartz here in the studio at the Montana World Affairs Council. And author Steve Porter joining us here in the studio. Go ahead.
Steve, why don't you pick up in terms of some of the points that we were discussing off
Yeah.
there that you want to go with? Because this is a fascinating look and insight into who are we?
Yeah.
And why do we do what we do?
Yeah. One thing in a lot of my work, and when I talk about this, when I teach about these issues, about the intersection of the United States and ethics and through humanitarian projects, especially refugee aid, but some others, one of the things that I mention is that I don't always talk about, say, U.S. refugee policies. I do because sometimes that word makes sense. But I often will talk about it in broader terms, like initiatives or endeavors and that kind of thing. And the reason why I do that is that, and you're talking about how do we define America, and I think this fits into that, is that these initiatives, these international humanitarian initiatives that sometimes come home to U.S. soil in terms of, say, refugee resettlement, these initiatives have been engaged in for a good century, if not more, by a thorough interaction, partnership, sometimes clumsy partnerships, sometimes antithetical and angry partnerships between the state government and these non-governmental organizations. Today we call them NGOs. We may think of them as voluntary agencies. Sometimes they refer to themselves as philanthropies or charities. And when we look at this field of humanitarian aid, whether it's domestic refugee resettlement or international war aid or refugee aid in camps abroad, it's almost never just a government entity or ever just an NGO. It's this integration of the two of them. We were hearing earlier about the United States, sort of power carving out a space for some of these humanitarian initiatives. And that's usually we think of that with regards to the government. And so that's part of the phenomenon that occurs, is that the U.S. power abroad will give space to actors here in the United States who want to engage with these folks. And it's not always a happy marriage. So when I suggest this, I don't mean that everything's always harmonic. But when we think of America, these are sort of the various sort of forces and sectors in the United States, civil society, government, who end up coming together in this particularly heady brew of humanitarian aid.
So have you looked at, through your research, and identified where somebody has actually looked at this from a 30,000-foot view
Right.
and said, yeah, we kind of got this messy brew
Mhm.
taking place, and for the most part, it kind of works. But is there reasons to streamline this? And has there been various times throughout history where that nexus has come together only to separate again?
This is a really great question, and I imagine it's one I'm going to elaborate on tonight in my remarks. But It could be one example. After World War II, the United States implemented its first ever large-scale refugee aid programs. The very first one was called the Displaced Persons Program, ran from the late 1940s to the 1950s, admitted about 400,000 folks from Central and Eastern Europe, many of whom were coming from behind this new Iron Curtain of the Soviet sphere. And many of the organizations who were there to assist these folks, both abroad and then also once they came to the United States, to resettle them in different communities, hopefully with a job and so forth and housing. These resettlement agencies, if you will, were civil society organizations. They were voluntary organizations, sectarian based. You had the pan-Protestant group. The Lutherans kind of like to be on their own over here. You had the Catholic Bishops Association, the Jewish organization, and one that was kind of non-sectarian that's still around with us today. Well, they often were scrambling for money, unsurprisingly, and some of the members of these organizations really wished government would pitch in a little bit more, since the United States government was saying, hey, folks are voting with their feet. They are not wanting to stay over there in the communist world. They're coming here to the land of freedom. Everybody in the world here, we're going to let you know through Voice of America that this is what they're doing. In other words, here's one of the intersections between foreign policy and kind of humanitarian aid. But the government forces that were there, different elected officials, thought that it wouldn't be prudent to give money for effectively what would be welfare services to these quote unquote new Americans. They thought it would be politically dangerous, that sort of hardline anti-communist folks in the United States, think Joe McCarthy, right, could paint this as sort of a pinko move, right, a red move, a communist move, giving money from the government to these people. That's welfare. And here we're bragging that the United States is different. We don't need that kind of thing here. Well, fast forward a little bit to when you have scores of thousands of Cubans coming from 90 miles off the coast of Miami, beginning especially in the early 1960s. And the folks of Dade County and of the state of Florida more generally are saying, we do not have the public resources for this. And
the boat people.
Yeah. And the charities, the voluntary aid organizations I'm talking about, they can't handle it either. And yet foreign policy dictated that this would be good for the United States. So at that point, the federal government jumps in and starts paying directly through the voluntary agencies, or as a funnel, but starts paying significant amount of money for their resettlement, to find them housing and jobs and food and so forth. And so it came together at that moment. And if I could very quickly, if we fast forward until the last recent years, this is still the apparatus, is still the setup that we have today, where the federal government, through today, the Department of State, Health and Human Services, funnels money through these licensed voluntary agencies. They're formally licensed these days. They kind of operate as surrogate arms of the state to a degree, as well as advocates for refugees. They funnel money through them that goes to the refugees on a per capita basis. And in a sense, many in the voluntary agencies that I've spoken with have thought this has been a very wonderful, necessary thing. It's not a ton of money per refugee, but it helps them get on their feet, right? Well, when you have more recent political events that have occurred under the current administration, but even before, where all of a sudden that money begins to get drawn back, the numbers of refugees who can come in are cut dramatically, these organizations suddenly have no other way to operate, or few other ways to operate. They don't have other financial pipelines coming in, and so they've been laying people off at enormous numbers, and many of these organizations have had to close in recent years as the number of refugees who've come in have gone away, and it's not clear how easy it's going to be for them to build back up.
Hey, with that, we're going to take another break. 721-1290 is our number, and if you wouldn't mind being more specific about what those groups are when we come back. So anyway, 721-1290, we'll be right back. A little bit of snow coming down, so hey, guess what? It's November. We'll be right back.
Why are they so worried about recovering when essentially isn't it just a money issue? So if the money pops back up,
so the problem is, so the money comes in per capita per refugee head. If suddenly you go from 100,000 refugees a year to next year, you're supposed to be up to maybe 18, and that's it, right? That's significant. That's 80% cut. When that happens, this is the main pipeline of funding that these organizations have, and if they don't have it for 1, 2, 3 years, they have salaries to pay, and they literally can't do it. So there's organizations, and not only that. So a couple of years ago, current administration put forth a directive that said, if you have not resettled 100, if you local organizations, so you have the national organizations, which I'll talk about in a second, and then you have the feeder organizations at the state and local levels, Missoula does too. that get this money, and that, and this is where you end up seeing them in the churches and so forth, and those are the ones who are really doing the work. But but this is all kind of with funding and resources and overall planning. It's done from kind of the national headquarters, sometimes international, but it's the local organizations. Whereas if you hadn't resettled 100 over the last year, and for a small community like Missoula, that would be entirely possible, I would imagine. I think I'm going to talk with some of the folks who work in one or two of these.
You're probably talking soft landing.
Yeah, soft landing. Yeah. And I don't actually know their situation now, but I wouldn't be surprised if this hit them. Then all of a sudden, that means literally the federal government said, if you didn't do 100 last year, you cannot operate next year.
I get their newsletter, and when that edict first came out that they were going from whatever it was down to 18,000. I mean, she was just crying out for help, because
it might literally mean that I've got a stat here that in the last, I think, 2-3 years, and this I bet is even more now, but the number of local resettlement agencies has gone from 325 to 200 in just, I think, about 2 years.
And
they've got rent, they've got mortgages. Yeah,
that could change again with a change of administration.
It can, but it'll be hard to ramp back up.
Right. And we do this all the time now. I mean, the point you're making, I've seen this whole spectrum of nonprofits where everybody rushes into the void and it can't absorb.
Right.
Okay, we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. That's Nick Christensen right over there taking your phone calls. I'm Peter Christian. Bob Seidenschwartz here in the studio. Author Steve Porter is visiting from the University of Cincinnati and going to be giving a lecture and answering some questions tonight. So please go ahead.
So, Steve, I want to continue on the course here, but I still want the audience to understand that often global events are what we react to. And moments in time give us the direction that we take. And you mentioned something off air, which for the longest period of time, communism, that was the 800-pound gorilla in this world that you're describing here. And it drove both policy as well as funding, as well as who responded to various people coming from authoritarian regimes. So when did that start to change and this starts to dissipate?
Yeah. So the United States, during the Cold War, admitted about 1.5 million refugees, again, largely from Europe, but also from Cuba, and then near the tail end of that period, of course, beginning in 1975, from parts of Indochina, especially Vietnam, but also beyond. As the Cold War ends, you think, well, what's the litmus test anymore? If during the Cold War, the litmus test was you're persecuted by a communist regime, you got a shot to get in here as a refugee around normal mainstream. Which,
hard to argue with the outcomes.
Right. And there was sort of a geopolitical element to it. There was undoubtedly usually a humanitarian justification for it. And there are, of course, also other folks who were undoubtedly being persecuted and by at least international law standards should have been eligible refugees to enter who weren't. So it's a complicated issue, but communism kind of fueled the rationales for this. Well, what happens after the Cold War ends, around 1990? Well, first of all, over the next decade, vast majority of the refugees entering the United States were still from former or current communist regimes. So it took a while, right? History kind of has some resiliency sometimes. It's got some momentum. And so during the 1990s, 3/4 of refugees who entered the United States were actually still from the former Soviet sphere and from Vietnam and neighboring states. So as after effects of that war. However, by the late 90s, so in this case, by the end of the Clinton administration, we see the United States begins to sort of shed this Cold War rationale, at least move it more to the side, and begin to adopt, as many refugee advocates, both in the U.S. and beyond, it begins to adopt more international norms for who it decides to at least consider admitting and not, based on international human rights law, international refugee law that the United States actually had been party to for a while by that point, but often didn't kind of abide by.
What was the catalyst?
The catalyst for the change.
This change, because somebody didn't wake up and say, as a senator, I think we need to do this. There were some forces at work.
Yeah, so I think we have to understand a kind of balance of power, just kind of shifting at this point. There had long been folks in the United States foreign policy apparatus, in government more generally, as well as the nonprofit sector, who had said, look, since 1951, when there was a refugee convention, it said, people who are persecuted on behalf of, on basis of race, religion, political affiliation, social group, and so forth, really ought to be considered as refugees for admission to a country, regardless of whatever else. That became kind of even less geographically constrained with a 1967 protocol that the United States had set onto. So there had been pushes for the United States to move in this direction for a long time, perpetually speaking. 1970s was a huge human rights moment. Jimmy Carter, we might remember, sort of promotes human rights as part of foreign policy. There'd been momentum that had been increasing, and yet the Cold War persisted, and that proved to be, by and large, more powerful. And so my read on this, and this is some of the research that I've been doing more recently, and so frankly, I'm still trying to get my head around it, is that the power of the Cold War took a while to wear off, about a decade, and that's the answer.
As it always does. The curtain doesn't just go down and say, now we're out of this, and it's a multipolar world. Yeah.
Well, and so one of the effects of this is that the United States begins working with the United Nations Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, High Commission for Refugees. It begins adopting international laws more firmly, and it begins to, as a consequence, allowing into, as refugees, the United States, folks from about the same numbers of people, in fact, even somewhat fewer at times, but folks from a vastly more diverse set of countries than it used to. Dozens and scores of countries all of a sudden are represented from all these different regions of the world. And so human rights activists, refugee advocates, many of these folks were thrilled. International law proponents were thrilled. And yet at some point, either tonight or a little later this morning, I can talk about where I think there's a little bit of a double-edged sword for refugee advocates in terms of that change.
Right. And I would like to find out from your perspective, what's going on with the turmoil in the Middle East and the Taliban and the people, quite literally millions of people fleeing that area, heading to wherever they could go. Most of them went into Europe. Some have come here.
Right.
But I want to get your take on that. Yeah. In other words, is there a different paradigm here? Because they're moving into areas that had not had a lot of immigration over the past. That America had kind of taken the mantle of, bring us your tired poor, because we have this huge country to populate.
Right.
And we're already populated. Thank you very much. So anyway, 721-1290 is the number. We're coming right back after this.
So, Steve, when I look at this, I realize to think that you can have it all game planned out is probably not only practical, but it doesn't happen. But have you uncovered anything that identifies when the U.S. decides to go into, from a military standpoint, a region? They may have very good reasons to. Do they have enough information, enough manpower and thought as to what happens afterwards? Is that a part of the overall strategic types of policy planning?
The humanitarian concern or the stability concern.
Right. So we go into Vietnam. What happens if we lose? We go into the Middle East. What happens if this explodes? I have to think that that's part of it, but I'm not sure that that's the case.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's probably one answer for that, but I think that these days you do have specialists, say in the departments of Defense and State Department that do think about these things, but often it takes that.
Now, are there other countries that people who can't stay where they are clamoring to get to? Is it Sweden? Is it Norway? Is it or is it America right at the top of the heap, number one, and everything else is kind of
if they're in Europe, they want to get to certain countries in Europe.
Yeah, go to Sweden.
They want to go to Sweden.
Yeah.
They want to go to Germany.
Right.
The benefits are better.
Because of the social network.
The social network.
I should say the social contract that the Norwegian folk or the Scandinavian folks set up with their
much more robust
within themselves,
right?
Yeah. But they weren't expecting, wait a minute, we got 3 million more people that want the same stuff.
Right.
So,
and even amongst refugees here, it's not equalized. There's different groups that have received different benefits.
Certainly.
And is it worthy for you to mention in terms of issues going forward, such as climate change disruption? Especially
all right, thanks for joining us on this Monday edition of Talk Back. We're talking about to a very fascinating guy, Steve Porter. He's from the University of Cincinnati here in Missoula to lecture tonight at the University of Montana about his book, The Benevolent Empire. We've been visiting here for the last 45 minutes or so, and so I asked you some questions during the break about the recent massive migration that went out of the Middle East because of what happened in Syria and the Taliban and all the warring factions going on there, people literally dying in the streets and wanting to go somewhere. And so that mass immigration left, most of them went to Europe. But some, I imagine, wanted to come here. So when you talk about this benevolent empire being the United States of America, Europe has also entered into this as well. Is that
Yes,
right?
indeed. And actually, let me pause for a moment here. Most actually of the folks who have fled Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, for instance, actually are not in Europe or the United States, but rather are housed temporarily, vastly more, in fact, are temporarily in the neighboring states.
Like Jordan.
So Jordan has a lot. In order right now, Turkey has between 3 and 4 million folks, mostly from Syria.
Which they threatened.
Yes, of course, they're threatening to
on Europe as a result of some of these issues we've seen here with Syria, the Kurds, and this is where this gets so multifaceted, because you can't look at this through a singular prism. You need to consider the variables here.
When I said humanitarianism isn't just humanitarianism in a vacuum, I didn't mean because everybody has an evil side.
Right.
I meant that it operates in the world and there's always other factors. And so this is about foreign policy. This is about domestic welfare policy. This is about economics. This is about attempts for some folks to be good to other people in the world, right? It's about all of these things, and often in very combined forms. But Turkey, 3 to 4 million folks from Iraq and Afghanistan. Pakistan, about 1.5 million people from Afghanistan, refugees. Lebanon has, I think, about 1 million folks in it. So I first want to mention that there's a distinction between permanent resettlement, right, of the sort we talk about when we talk about folks coming here to the United States as refugees from farther abroad, or to Sweden or to Germany from the Middle East and North Africa, perhaps, versus what we think of as sort of temporary asylum. Now, temporary asylum can mean your whole life, but legally speaking, that's the idea.
Came from the Congo to Missoula for 20 plus years,
right,
in the refugee camps before they were given a status.
Right, exactly. But anyway, but getting to your point about whether indeed the United States still is the probably most sought after place for most immigrants, I think even when considering a change in rhetorical tone in this country, at least in terms of degree over recent years, all the evidence that I see still suggests that if folks can get to the United States,
according to your book, it dwarfs on a combined basis. If you add up 40 of the countries who take in refugees, the U.S. is still taking more.
Here's an interesting stat. The United States, since the end of World War II, I believe that probably since 1948, 49, don't quote me on that, but I believe that would be the year. So since roughly right after World War II, all the way up until last year, the United States had, and I think almost always, if not always, each year as well, but had also collectively resettled on a permanent basis, right, with the opportunity to get legal permanent residency here and then potentially have a pathway to citizenship. So just as other immigrants would, the United States had permanently resettled more refugees than the rest of the countries of the world combined. However, this last year, the United States for the first time actually dipped below another country, and that was Canada. In this case. So things are, one of the things I think about when I look back at history and study it is how, as Mark Twain says, if history doesn't always rhyme, it sure does seem to echo, right? A lot of, to paraphrase him anyway, that there are a lot of echoes here. But yet there are things that also change sometimes.
Well, and I want to talk about one of the biggest thing that echoes in a lot of our thinking is the economics.
Right.
When we're looking at taking people in, one of the never-ending retorts is we need to take care of our own people first.
Right.
Now, our own people may have been a generation ago and several generations ago the very people we're talking about, but when you talk about Turkey or the neighboring countries, the economic impact is overwhelming. You mentioned little Lebanon.
Right.
A quarter of the country is refugees and immigrants that have come in as a result of these, wars in the area. They cannot physically and financially handle this. Is that also an accurate statement to say the U.S. has been strained by refugees over the decades, or is it actually accretive to our culture and our economy when you look at the longer runway?
It's a tremendous question. First of all, I'll mention when we talk about Lebanon or a Turkey or a Pakistan, these are countries, even if you think of a Turkey, that are not nearly as wealthy as the United States is, but also the numbers of asylees that they have, temporary asylees that they have right now, percentage-wise to the population, and in terms of what would be taxed on the economy, just dwarfs anything that the United States, even the most sort of generous advocates of refugee admissions would ever imagine. So it's an apples and oranges question as far as I'm concerned. That said, in terms of what have refugees done for this country, there are different studies over the years that one can see. I think by and large, most reasonable observers, economic historians and the like, who look back, suggest that time and time again, really whatever group, whether we're talking Europeans from the mid to late 19th century, Germans, Irish, eventually Italians, Russian Jews, and so forth, coming in at the turn of the century. A few Jewish refugees who were admitted during the Holocaust in the 1930s and into the early 40s, or the Europeans, for the most part, who came in during the Cold War, as well as Cubans and Indochinese and so forth. They had two things in common. Every single one of those groups had people who said this will change the fabric of our country in a bad way, and they will tax our resources, economy and public resources as well, to the degree where we can't sustain this. And over time, those predictions, I would argue, I think reasonable observers would suggest, have not actually proven to be the case. More recent examples here, we know that there are arguments against letting certain new groups from, say, the Middle East or Africa in, because there are folks who, for cultural reasons, say this will change the cultural fabric of our lives. They don't want to learn English and so forth. It's too different. Their religion is too different. I'm not going to weigh in on that. It's a bit above my pay grade for this morning. What I will say is, if I speak about this economically, there are two very good studies that came out just a couple years ago, and I'm just going to mention one stat. One of them was actually from the Department of Health and Human Services, and in 2017 it looked back at the decade prior and showed that refugees in this country earned, that is, paid into the public pool for taxes at local, state, and federal levels, $63 billion more than they took. So that is, they brought in almost $270 billion in terms of, or paid that in terms of revenues, in terms of taxes and the like, and the net difference there was $63 billion. So that's but I think that's something that echoes actually through time.
And with that, we're going to take another break. And also, Sean, when we come back, you'll need your headphones. We're going to talk with Sean. And we have 3 other lines open, and only, folks, about 8 minutes left in our visit with Steve Porter, author of the book called Benevolent Empire. He's here in Missoula to do a lecture tonight at the University of Montana. We'll be back.
Won't put them on yet.
Great discussion.
This is only 60 seconds. So.
Okay.
Just a quick break.
Okay.
It's hard to get people to think of the big picture, as you just described, what the benefits could be, because we deal with what does it cost me today?
Right, exactly.
And you're asking me to think 20, 30 years. I'm not concerned about 20, 30 years. I'm concerned about my taxes.
I'll be gone in 20 or 30.
Right. I'll be with you, Peter. I'm right behind you. But this is the never-ending.
Unless I eat my Wheaties.
Literally.
Yeah, it is.
battle that we
See it
go
again and again. Yeah.
All righty then. Thanks for joining us here on Talkback. Let's get right to the phones, and we like to get our callers on as quickly as we can. So, Sean, you're on with Steve Porter. Please go ahead.
Oh, well, good morning again.
Good morning. Good morning.
I'm just calling on the status of these people that come in. I don't think they should threaten our gaining birth thing with the illegal and everything combined. But just 4 quick points. I don't think they should be given preference over our citizens and people that are in the streets and veterans and everything. And I disagree with them setting up their own little mini nations. And then I thought that the refugee rules that they would be set up in a similar area, and the dollars that are spent over there go farther over there than bringing them here. I'm not being untoward toward them, but anyway, just a couple thoughts.
All right. Well, thanks for your call. So you wanted to address that. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, sure. I'm not here this morning to weigh in on one side or the other as to what American refugee policy should be right now. What I will say is that we do have a lot of echoes today that I've seen in the past, but with different groups of people, that there are always those in this country who are concerned that if we let refugees in from a certain place, and they might be from Germany, they might be from Vietnam, they might be from Cuba or Hungary, that if we let these folks in, that there's going to be problems. Part of the problems that they're going to, the argument goes, take resources, including jobs, public resources, schooling and the like, away from American citizens. That's certainly one concern. And then there's the kind of cultural concern that these folks who we might let in will change the fabric of our country. This is a common refrain that we've seen over the years. And again, I'm not going to weigh in as to what that means our policy should be, but I will say that the concerns of this sort that Sean has have been echoed for different groups for many times over. When I look back at public polling over the decades, going many decades back now, about a given refugee group that might be let in. So I'm thinking, for instance, Jews, even Jewish orphans in the 1930s. In almost every instance, public polling says no, we don't want these folks here. What does that mean? I'm not sure, but I do think that sometimes, maybe even often, when we look back in hindsight and in the rearview mirror, we often recognize that these various groups have in time come to contribute rather mightily, I would say, at times to the United States. Now, are there specific instances each time as times change? Sure, perhaps. But also, again, as I stated, I quoted some statistics a moment ago, that I think the general recognition now is that in time, these refugee communities do, in fact, contribute in a variety of ways, including recent ones, and including economically.
Wait, another caller. Yep. Sue, good morning. You're on with our guest, Steve Porter. Please go ahead.
Morning. Yeah,
Hi.
I just wondered the fear that Americans have about refugees taking their jobs. I don't know if anyone saw the 60 Minutes report last night about this chef who started a Indian kitchens at a truck stop.
I was flying high over the Rockies last night, Sue. I didn't see that.
Oh, well, there was a story about truck drivers, and there are mostly immigrants, and because truck driving is hard work, and there's less and less Americans truck drivers, and so they're building. This guy started serving Indian food at truck stops, and he's starting building restaurants all over the country based on the fact that so many truck drivers are immigrants. So, I think this fear is so unfounded about...
Yeah. No, go ahead, Sue.
This fear is so unfounded about immigrants and refugees taking American jobs. They do the work that Americans don't want to do.
All right, thanks, Sue. Appreciate the call.
The National Bureau of Economic Research did a study, one of these studies that I'm talking about, not the one from Health and Human Services, but the National Bureau of Economic Research is made up of a bunch of respected economists, different political stripes and so forth. So it's a nonpartisan, very serious research organization. They came out with a study a couple of years ago, I think it was in 2017, that showed that refugees coming in, and this is the case with a number of immigrants, but certainly with refugees who are admitted into this country, take jobs that literally often are not taken otherwise, right? And often in the service industries. Now, there are refugees who come in with certain specialized skills as well, but a great many of them don't have those skills, to be honest about this, and yet they are taking jobs of the sort that you're describing here that are needed in the economy. And the other thing with refugees that come in, we have to remember, some of them are coming in fairly bad shape. And that's something that I think we need to recognize in our public discourse about what happens, whether we let them in or we don't. And if we let them in, what do we do? How do we care for them? It's part of the reason why there's this organized resettlement issue that explains why there's folks from Africa and Missoula, Montana, and folks from Indochina in the middle of Iowa. It's because there's sort of this organized resettlement element to it. And one of the things that is useful to recognize about this is that refugees in about 5 or 6 years actually are employed at greater rates than Americans are, and typically doing jobs that a lot of American citizens haven't wanted to do.
And the other thing is that the American economy is not a zero-sum game.
Right.
There's only so many jobs. Well, guess what? So this individual decided to open an Indian restaurant, and all of a sudden, the supply and demand. I'm going to open some more. I'm going to hire a bunch of people. I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm going to do something that actually people want. I think that's great.
Refugees and often many other immigrants are, in fact, very good capitalists. That's true. And we see that through time, different groups of folks over the decades.
And this is one of the reasons that when you compare some of the issues of absorption versus other countries, we do a far better job in this country of doing so for a number of reasons. Some organic and some by the uniqueness of what you just described, Peter.
Okay, real quick, where is your event tonight? And public's welcome to attend, I'm assuming?
Certainly, absolutely. Please come if you're interested. Be interested in meeting you and chatting with you. It's at the Ollie Auditorium at 7 o'clock this evening on the University of Montana's campus.
Right, excellent. And where can we find your book?
You can find my book on Amazon.com if you'd like. It's also published by the University of Pennsylvania Press if you wanted to visit that. But I think they have a thing called Google that anybody who wants to get it, it's called Benevolent Empire. My name is Porter, as the guy who carries your bag, or maybe some of the history knowledge. So,
all right. Well, it's been a pleasure meeting you. Thank you.
Thank you.